Hi, welcome to Prime Recap. A street dog has his fate completely changed when he decides to fight alongside young American soldiers who join forces with the French to defeat the German army. Today we will recap the story of the 2018 movie Sergeant Stubby, an American hero. This is the story of how a little street dog became a great soldier and fought alongside his best friend in the First World War. The poor mutt spent his entire life going through garbage cans in search of food, and was often treated brutally by troglodytes who do not have an ounce of humanity. However, even so, every now and then, the dog managed to find something to eat. One day, while running through the streets in search of shelter, the animal ends up losing its bone in a crowd and, while looking for food, comes across a platoon of American soldiers. Seeing the hungry dog, Robert decides to throw a cookie to him, and the animal begins to follow him. The year is 1917 and the United States has gone to war against Germany. Thousands of young people, from all corners of the country, have been called up to fight. When the American army entered the war, the French and British had already been fighting the mighty German army for 3 long years. The European soldiers were already discouraged, but their hope was renewed when they learned that the United States was sending help. After a few minutes of walking, the platoon reaches the training center, but the mud is barred at the door. So he goes looking for another passage and manages to get in by going under the wooden fence. His first stop is the kitchen, but the dog is chased away by the cook. While running away from the madman, the animal ends up running over Robert and starts sniffing him for more cookies. The boy orders the dog to go away before he gets into trouble, but it is too late, because just then the dog barks and gets Sergeant Casburn's attention. Seeing the animal's good behavior, the sergeant asks Robert to give him food, and the cook is forced to share his terrible dishes with the dog, even against his will. During lunch, Hans Schroeder, a boy of German descent, reveals that he was surprised at the sergeant for letting the dog stay. However, Olsen states that the colonel will not accept the animal. During the night, he plans to sleep in Robert's bed, but the soldier forbids him to do so and orders the dog to sleep on the floor. The next morning, when the alarm rings, the youngsters wake up scared and are getting ready for another intense day of training. The dog accompanies the soldiers all the way and practices all the training alongside them. Before long, everyone becomes attached to the animal, including the sergeant. Casburn praises the dog for his good performance and says that he is much fitter than most of the members of his platoon. A few nights have passed and now Robert allows the dog to climb into his bed. The boy is determined to keep him and even chooses a name for his new friend. From that day on, the former street dog would be called Stubby. However, Olsen says that when the colonel finds out about the dog, he will send him away. In an attempt to avoid being separated from his friend, Robert uses his downtime to teach him some tricks. In this way, Stubby could captivate the colonel from being expelled. Fortunately, his plan works. A few days later, when the colonel goes to pick up the platoon, he is impressed to see the dog saluting and states that the animal is as welcome in the army as any man. That afternoon, the soldiers must go through one last training session before they are sent to the battlefield. Casburn orders his men to put on their gas masks and takes them into a barn. After releasing the tear gas, he orders the young men to remove their masks, and immediately everyone starts coughing. At that moment, the sergeant opens the door for them to leave and says that in the war they will face even worse gases. That is why they need to keep their masks by their side at all times. Since there are no masks for dogs, Stubby has to use his paws to protect himself from the remnants of smoke coming out of the barn. In the following weeks, even Biscuit started to like the animal and always offers him more food. While giving new directions to the platoon, which is about to go to France to fight alongside the French, the colonel says he is proud of all of them and says that Stubby will be a great assistant to help train the next soldiers. Upon hearing this, Robert realizes that the time has come to say goodbye to his friend. Before he leaves, he writes one last letter to Margaret, his older sister, and packs his bags for the trip. Stubby doesn't understand what is going on, but he realizes that Robert is sad and reaches into his suitcase. However, the boy promises he will be back soon and gives the dog a parting gift. The animal takes a while to get used to the collar, but is happy to see himself in the mirror wearing it. Robert then ties a rope around the dog and takes it into the kitchen. The cook agrees to stay with Stubby until the boy returns and promises that he will take good care of him. Heartbroken, Robert hands the dog over, and the cook ties him up in a corner of the kitchen. Determined to follow his companion wherever he went, Stubby manages to untie the rope and breaks free. He follows Robert's scent through the streets and jumps on a train, for he knows the boy is inside. When they arrive at the pier, the animal sees his friend boarding the ship and sneaks in some boxes of supplies to get on the ship. During the long journey, Stubby comes out of his hiding place and takes care not to be seen while following Robert's trail. Quickly, The dog finds the room where the soldiers were huddled together to sleep and sniffs shoe by shoe until he identifies the boy's feet. To his surprise, Robert is woken up in the middle of the night and is extremely happy to see the dog. Now, his concern is that the animal will not be discovered, and for this he enlists the help of his two friends. The trio intends to hide Stubby, but is eventually discovered by the captain. Upon receiving the dog's greeting, the man orders the soldiers to make an identification plate for him and allows the animal to become an official member of the platoon. When they reach their destination, the soldiers walk through the trenches and are startled to see the grim situation of the French who had been in battle for years. As expected, Stubby finds a way to make himself useful as soon as he arrives at the camp. He begins his work by scaring all the pests out of the trenches. It is not long before the young soldiers witness their first attack, and Robert is dedicated to protecting his friend at any cost. From his first day on the war field, the dog takes on an important mission: to help rescue soldiers who have been wounded or buried. During lunch, Robert asks the cook to serve some food to his dog, but the man refuses. At this point, Hans is furious and claims that Stubby is the official mascot of his platoon. Furious, the cook offends the boy and says that he will not take orders from a German. In order to defend his friend, Olsen gets into the argument and fights with the Frenchman. Suddenly, Gaston shows up to separate them and forces them to make up. Gaston then tells them that his captain has ordered him to work together with Robert. While they take a break for lunch, the Frenchman tells them that his officers have asked him, Robert and Stubby, to keep an eye on the Germans. Hans and Olsen are also invited to help them in their mission and are terrified when they see, for the first time, an entire city that has been destroyed by the Germans. The group walks for several hours until they reach the camp, and the next morning Gaston is to wake Robert so that they can begin their espionage mission. Hiding in the bushes, the pair use binoculars to see what the enemy army is up to and discover that they intend to use toxic gas to attack them. Immediately, they run to sound the alarm and Stubby spots an enemy soldier hiding in the trees. Robert is about to be eliminated when the dog knocks him down, preventing the boy from being hit by a bullet. They keep running to get to the horses, however, the animals are startled by the sound of gunfire and run away. At Robert's request, Stubby goes to warn the soldiers about the attack, which allows them to prepare to resist the gas. Then the dog goes to warn the residents of the neighboring village and everyone runs to their homes. Before the gas reaches the town, Gaston and Robert show up and rescue the animal. They run to hide in a barn and Gaston improvises a mask for Stubby, using a damp cloth to cover his snout. When the gas invades the city, all the residents are safe and wait, patiently, until the effect of the gas has worn off. Minutes later, the air is clear again and everyone is alive thanks to the American hero, Stubby. The heroism of that little being makes Robert endure the passing of days in that terrible place. On the way back to camp, Stubby manages to hunt a rabbit and Gaston uses the animal's meat to make a nice soup. After dinner, the Frenchman invites Robert for a walk, and Stubby accompanies them. While they talk, Gaston shows the young man a photo of his family. He has a beautiful wife and 3 daughters whom he has not seen for 2 years. Robert tells how his parents died a few years ago and his older sister Margaret was the one who took care of him and his 2 younger sisters. However, even in the midst of this chaos, the boy still has hopes of returning to the United States and building his own family. While contemplating the night in the mountains, the camp suffers an attack and the trio rushes to help them. Private Claiborne was wounded on the other side of the barrier and the sergeant says they need to find him. Immediately, Stubby rushes to the area where the bombing is taking place and deflects the attacks as he begins his rescue mission. Worried, Robert goes after his friend and the dog starts barking when he finds the wounded soldier. Soon after, other soldiers show up to rescue their companion and all manage to return safely to camp. Several months pass and the platoon of young Americans moves to a new war zone in Seychelles. Before he leaves, Stubby is given a small robe as a thank you for alerting the villagers about the gas. Gaston also has a present for him and tells that his sergeant made a gas mask especially for the dog. As soon as they arrive at their new destination, the young Americans suffer an attack and Stubby lures some German invaders into being captured by Robert and Gaston. Minutes later, explosives begin to be thrown into the trenches and Stubby catches one of them to prevent Olsen from being hit. However, while saving his companion, the dog ends up being injured by the explosion and Robert runs to help him. Hans is also wounded and Olsen seeks a doctor to help him. Meanwhile, Robert runs into the medical ward with his friend in his arms and begs for someone to help him. Since the dog has suffered a serious injury, he needs to be transferred to a hospital and the doctor asks Robert to put him in the ambulance. Then Hans arrives, being carried on a stretcher, and they both proceed together to the hospital. After Hans and Stubby are injured, the conflicts in Seychelles become even worse and the rains arrive in the region. It rains day after day, without any truce, and as a consequence the whole region becomes one big swamp. For all the weeks that he was away from his friend, Robert felt completely lost. The only thing he could do was hope that his Stubby was still alive. Gradually, the Germans managed to advance towards Paris, and the only thing preventing them from succeeding are the American soldiers working in tandem with the French. The friendship between Gaston and Robert only grew stronger during this hazy period, until Gaston is ordered to return to the base of his regiment. At this point, Robert feels even more alone, for he has just lost the company of yet another friend. After many days of intense battles, the French and American soldiers managed to recapture Seicheprey and force the Germans to retreat. One night during a bombing raid, Robert writes a letter to his sister, Margaret, in which he tries to reassure her about the war. The boy claims to be fine and says that even the food is good to the point that he can eat almost anything. Robert says that it has been almost a month since Stubby was injured and he has not yet received any news from his friend. However, the boy remains hopeful that the dog is being well cared for and hopes that the war will be over very soon. When Hans wakes up in the hospital, Stubby is by his side. The dog is almost fully recovered, but still has an injury on one of his paws. When it realizes that Robert is not there, the animal decides to go out after him and takes a long walk to find him. He is already starving when he smells sausages being prepared by a couple of German soldiers. Stubby sneaks around and steals the food. He then has to run away in order not to be shot. One morning when Olsen gets up, he realizes that Robert is not well. The boy is coughing desperately and can barely stand up. His friend then calls a doctor to examine him, and the doctor says that he is very sick. Therefore, he will need to take him to follow up and give him the necessary treatment. In 1918, the world was hit by a fatal flu epidemic. Robert also caught this disease, and the virus spread rapidly among the soldiers. Robert was no longer having the strength to continue, and all he wanted at that moment was to see his friend Stubby again. Meanwhile, the dog follows the trail of his best friend, but hunger, fatigue, and the injury to his paw prevent him from continuing. However, after a few minutes of rest, Stubby manages to gather his strength and returns to his mission of finding Robert. In the middle of the night, while keeping watch, Olsen spots something moving through the bushes and grabs his gun, believing it to be an enemy soldier. However, the boy gets a nice surprise when he finds out that Stubby has returned and managed to find them. Robert is hanging by a thread when he receives a visit from his best friend. Stubby's presence gives him the strength he needs to get better, and as the days go by, the boy recovers. After 6 months of exhausting combat, Robert and Stubby take a leave of absence to visit Paris together with their American friends. Upon arriving in the beautiful city, Olsen and Hans go to talk to two beautiful young ladies who are walking along the streets while Robert goes to take a nice bath. At first, the French did not trust the Americans at all, but by the end of 1918 they had come to admire them and feel very grateful for all the help they provided. After a long night's rest, Robert and Stubby leave the hotel to explore Paris and take beautiful pictures all over the sights of the city. In September 1918, it was announced that the war was coming to an end and that the German army was retreating. In the middle of the night, Stubby sneaks out and attacks a German soldier. The man is a spy and tries to eliminate the dog. However, Robert and his companions arrive in time to stop him. In light of this act of bravery, the captain awards Stubby the honorary title of sergeant. From that day on, Sergeant Stubby wears the insignia of the U.S. Army, and Private Robert becomes the corporal of his platoon. To the boy's surprise, Gaston shows up to congratulate him on his great achievement. In the days that followed, the headlines of all the newspapers announced the last attack on the Germans. During the battle, a soldier appears to deliver excellent news. He tells that the war has finally come to an end and the Germans are going to sign an agreement to cease fire. However, this treaty will not be signed until the next day. So, until then, the two groups are still at war. That afternoon, the soldiers rest in the shade of an oak tree and Olsen says he intends to get married when he returns home. Gaston confesses that he has been away for so long that he is afraid to return home and his daughters will not recognize him. On November 11, 1918, the two groups faced each other in their last battle. It is difficult to understand why the soldiers were forced to fight until the last minute of that war. On that morning, many young men lost their lives, taking all their dreams with them. Seeing his friend, Gaston, in danger, Robert and Stubby rush to his aid, and the alarm sounds at that very moment, announcing the end of the war. In the middle of the battlefield, Stubby finds Olsen's helmet and takes it to Hans. Upon examining the equipment, the boy finds a hole, which indicates that Olsen was shot in the head. Everyone is deeply saddened by the boy's death, but relieved to know that they will never have to go through that again. That same day, Gaston says goodbye to his American friends, who are about to return to their country. When they arrive in the United States, the soldiers are greeted with great celebration and Sergeant Stubby makes history by being in all the newspapers as the most decorated dog in the United States. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.